So using this model of ours of transferring land and moving people, getting benefits to flow to people, oh, this thing has just come up here. There we go. At Pinder, we've looked at the, I'll go like this again. The land under agriculture employed 60 people, gross turnover only 150 rand per hectare per annum. The same land, 2 years later, after removing all the infrastructure and filling it with wildlife, employed 300 people and a turnover, gross turnover of 1,500 rand per hectare per annum. Significant change. What I won't say is how much it cost us to do that. We'll talk about that in another debate. There is huge capital required if you're going to convert conservation land. Huge, huge capital required. And from a tourism development point of view, it's very, very difficult to get any sensitive, ecologically sustainable development that can afford to do the land conversion as well. So I'm qualifying our model up front before we start with the reality of what it costs to do these kind of things. We used a very firm care of the land, care of the wildlife, and care of the people vision. And it was this unbelievable and completely passionate belief that all three of these things are interlinked. If we don't get economic benefits to the people, we'll never be able to protect the wildlife. And if we don't care for the land, the wildlife's not going to be sustained. And we need all those things for tourism, and we need them to work together. So everybody had to be mad. We need all of you to go back from this conference being mad. Mad means you've got to go and make a difference. No matter how small, every little difference that we make will improve the overall efforts of all of us. We pioneered eco-tourism sustainability, and we got quite a few awards for what we were doing. But the important thing was that we've stayed doggedly focused on what our initial vision was for the last 20 years. And that story that we've been able to sell to the staff, who've been able to sell it to the guests, is what sustained us. Through good times, through bad times, through the unbelievable upheavals of 1994, through the unbelievable euphoria of the new South Africa, to the current unbelievable hype with the World Cup coming at us. It's been absolutely an unbelievable journey. And that journey has been sustained by this relationship with the local people and our relationship with the land, which is critical. We only have 800 beds in the group. When you look at that spread across the world, it's not much. Smaller than an average small city hotel. But those 800 beds financially influence 8.5 million acres of wildlife real estate. 800 beds have successfully converted 500,000 acres of land from agriculture or hunting to tourism. 800 beds. We operate on communal land, we operate on private land, we operate in national parks. It doesn't matter who owns the land. What's important is that the land use is conservation. So we've tried to completely divorce land ownership from land use. And in doing so, we've been able to get unbelievable support from people we never ever thought would support us. Cattle farmers who've seen the economic advantages of chipping their land into a game reserve and getting their cattle land fenced into a game reserve, giving them a much bigger return than they were getting out of cattle. An unbelievable consequence that we never expected. So you get cooperative land uses with a cooperative fence around the outside and increased benefits for everybody inside. Wonderful, wonderful opportunities. More than $5 million a year gets paid by this small 800 beds into conservation through park fees and that kind of thing. Care of the wildlife, an absolutely essential part of what we do. Without a really good wildlife resource base, we have no future. So you've got an immediate environmental audit on the way you behave. It's because guests are worldly, they've traveled from all over the world, many of them are ecologists, biologists, botanists, or whatever, and they'll question every decision they see and everything you're doing. And your guides will be at the forefront. They'll be taking on those questions from these informed international intellectuals, and they'll be questioning what you do. So everything you do has to be defensible. As soon as you've got top-end tourism with top-quality guides, you've got an amazing internal audit. And one of the biggest challenges is getting wildlife management decisions passed by the guides, because they've got to try and sell it to the guests. And then the interaction becomes the guides are fighting for a decision which they don't want to happen, and the park managers are fighting for a decision that they do want to happen from a purely conservation point of view. And if the evidence is not strong enough to support the decision, it's a really difficult sell to the guides. So we start getting a real positive impact on conservation management from the tourism guides. And as soon as they start being interlinked to the management, it starts becoming a virtuous cycle. We reintroduced cheetah, which were considered to be completely impossible to reintroduce into wooded areas of northern KwaZulu-Natal. Our conservation authority, when I went to them and applied for a permit, said, no, you can't do it. I said, why? They said, well, we've tried. I said, really? When? They said, no, over the last 8 years, we've reintroduced 130 cheetah from Namibia into our parks in northern KwaZulu-Natal. We have a total of 12 left. We've had a net loss of more than 100 cheetah from our reintroduction. I said, whoa, it's reasonably understandable. It's thick wooded area, and Namibia's dry, open grassland. What reintroduction program did you use? They said, reintroduction program? We reduced 10 a month. I said, no, I didn't ask you how many. What program did you use? How did you habituate those desert cheetah to this wooded grassland? These things have never seen green grass in their lives. Ooh, they said. So we said, well, why don't you give us a temporary permit just for 10 to try what you've done, and if it works, then we can extend it for a year, just for 1 year. And after much cajoling, they eventually agreed that they would give me the temporary permit for 10. We started with 12 cheetah, and we brought in some more genes in the second year, so we had a reintroduction of 15 in total. We've sold 50 cheetah live out of that population. We know of more than 30 that have escaped from the fences and been destroyed by the neighbors. And we know of 30 that have been killed on the property by other predators, hyenas, lions, and leopard. So we've had a net gain of way over 100, just by taking a slightly different approach. And suddenly, all cheetah reintroductions in the country have been informed by this process. And just a little anecdote, we had an honors student from Monash University staying with us at the time, Dr. Luke Hunter, who's today the head of Panthera's Predator Research Program internationally. So a Melbourneian was involved in this project from day dot back in 1991. We've done the same with elephants. We were the first private sector operator to get adult elephants onto private land because the state said it wasn't possible to do it. So we had to get private operators, catch adult elephants, translocate them, develop the technologies, and then go and teach the state authorities and the conservation authorities how to do the same thing. This complete fear of the private sector, which existed 25 years ago, has turned completely. Today, the interactions between the private sector and the state in conservation in South Africa are extremely positive and much stronger, understanding that each have completely different roles and completely different qualifications in doing things. If in the state you make a mistake with an animal, you just write it in the book that was a mistake. If in the private sector you make a mistake with an animal, you pay for that animal. You pay for every animal you touch. So you can't afford to kill any animals. So a completely different approach to sustaining wildlife translocations existed in the private sector, and 25 years ago, most of the intellectual capital on translocations existed in the private sector. So a really important aspect of what we tried to do in working with the state. As we've moved on and the relationship between the state and the private sector has grown, we've seen that the state has also used the opportunity to engage with the private sector on issues that they're facing. Black rhino in South Africa have reached carrying capacity in all of the state reserves, and they're still a threatened species internationally and globally. How do we create more space for black rhino when we don't have any budget to buy more land? WWF stepped in and had an idea of trying to engage the private sector to use their land, which is perfect habitat, and host these state animals on their land. So this whole cooperative management system was developed, which is contractually tied down. It's unbelievably legally tight. The animals belong to the state. They at no stage belong to us as the test case because we had the strong relationship with the state. But we were able to achieve huge victories for conservation just through cooperation. So the health of the park was dependent on this relationship between the neighbors outside of the park and the park itself. And we were able to get the relationship to the point where the park actually said, we want you to keep half of the progeny of the rhinos. We said, we don't care who owns the progeny, because quite frankly, we don't want to do anything with the rhinos. We just want to give them a place to live, and we want to look at them with tourists. That's the difference. So this project was started by the conservation authorities. The only problem was they wanted to move the rhinos out of a wilderness area. Now, you know that you can't put vehicles into a wilderness area. So you need very big helicopters that don't land on the ground and people to be flown in to be able to move rhinos out of wilderness areas. A huge, unbelievably expensive exercise. But if you're going to stick to the integrity of your zonation in the national park, that's the kind of thing you've got to do. These rhinos were slung in big slings and flown out to an area just outside of the, just outside of the national park where they were dropped on the ground. blindfolded, radio transmitters put in their horns and then pushed into a truck and loaded for translocation. So what's been achieved with this unbelievable model? What we've done is we've effectively extended the size of the national park without any cost to the national parks. That's what we've effectively done, just through cooperation and trust. But it does require cooperation and trust. So the health of the parks and establishing and driving the parks has been something we've always been pretty good at.